Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the entire TMEA leadership. I'm delighted to be here with you. I always know I'm beyond the beltway when two things happen. People start being nicer and I feel overdressed. And both of those things have happened in the past 24 hours, so I'm not in Kansas anymore. I am here to talk to you in large part about the work that your national association is doing when it comes to federal lobbying and advocacy. But I don't want to leave without accomplishing another goal as well, which is talking to you about how I would love to see TMEA engage further on the advocacy front, speaking to some of the issues that Diane has mentioned already this morning, that others have talked about this morning, regarding the importance of the entire family of associations protecting music education. It is, of course, our cause, more so than ever now with the new direction that the National Association is heading that I'll talk to you a little bit more about, but it's a responsibility that goes far beyond the National Association, and it is my hope that over time we will continue to build up our state capacity to conduct advocacy work proactively, again, as Diane mentioned, rather than reactively, and to put all of your programs and your students in a better position to further the field for the next 100 years. So with that being said, first, just very briefly, a little bit about myself, my background. I actually have a visual arts background. I went to college for that particular purpose and ended up a political science major. So that didn't quite go the way that I thought it would, but I do have some unique perspective on the arts and arts learning as a result of that. And also the fact that my family, I've been lucky enough to have a family that's steeped in the arts, both music and visual arts, and so I had a lot of exposure growing up. It's something that's very personal to me, I care very deeply about, and being from the Washington, D.C. area, I've been lucky enough to be exposed to a lot of wonderful museums and performance venues and things of that nature. So I am somewhat cut from the same cloth, even though I took a different road than obviously all of you did. I was called back to then MENC about 3 years ago when Michael Butera, the current executive director, was hired to try to reinvigorate the advocacy energy that hadn't been lost but really had just kind of gotten stagnant for a number of years at then MENC. I actually, full disclosure, I worked at MENC when I was younger, and I had come straight off Capitol Hill during the time that Dr. John Mallman was the executive director, and there was a much smaller footprint for advocacy. So I got a little bit of exposure and familiarity with your issues, and then I went off and I worked for the American Psychological Association for a number of years on a broader variety of education issues. And when Michael Butera was hired, they called me up and they said, we're going to completely change the direction of the National Association. We're going to try to focus on becoming a 21st century advocacy organization, and we'd like you to be a part of building that shop for us internally in Reston and trying to expand the footprint not only in Washington, D.C., but throughout the country. That was a very, very exciting opportunity to me to kind of go home to a cause that I cared very deeply about, and I felt very lucky to have that chance. It's been a lot of fun so far. 3 years have gone by very quickly, and we've done a lot of really interesting work. I'm going to talk to you briefly about the three core components of what we are working on at the federal level. There are a lot of materials in the folders. I won't have a chance to get through them all with you today, but if you have questions after you review them, I'm sure Diane will encourage you to follow up with me either with a phone call or email anytime. Very quickly, on the left-hand side of your folders are a couple of materials on what the National Association does, kind of an overview from an advocacy perspective. I know that there's been a lot of conversation today, and I'm sure that there will continue to be at this level of your leadership about the value proposition of the National Association and what you get. I can talk to you specifically about that from an advocacy perspective, again telling you that it is our mission to become a 21st century advocacy organization and the leader in music education advocacy. I would go so far as to say that we actually have achieved that goal already. What I'd like to see is the states at that same level, and a few of them are, but it's a capacity building process. We're moving along over a number of years. We have an internal plan with benchmarks, and we're looking to develop each state in its own way. So you can learn more about what we do there. And then behind that sheet is a state and local level advocacy planning guide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm hopeful we can do together in collaborating between the national and Tennessee moving forward, but there's more detail on how state and local level advocacy works there. On the right side of the folder are a number of materials that deal with recent happenings with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in DC that your national association has been very involved with lobbying for. There is a rundown of recent events. There are legislative agendas and legislative asks pertaining to the work that we're doing if you care to know more about the specifics. And then there are some materials that we dropped off, that your leadership dropped off actually on June 28th during our recent Hill Day with key members of Congress to discuss our positions and our support for various initiatives regarding the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and other federal education initiatives. So that's a very quick overview of the folder. But with all that being said, let me talk to you more specifically about the work that we do in our lobby shop in Reston and why I think it's important for you here in Tennessee and for others across the country. There are three core components of our advocacy work. So number one, we call ourselves the national voice for music education. One of the first things that I noticed when I came to Reston about 3 years ago was that when we did an environmental scan of the organizations that were working on arts education issues broadly speaking, we found to our great concern that there were a couple of organizations, very well-intentioned organizations for the most part, that are not representative of arts educators, certainly not of music educators, but that had taken up the mantle, taken up the cause of conducting arts education work for the good of the field. So when I say the field now, I'm talking about music, visual, theater, dance, and of course media arts, which is now getting very big, very popular buzz terms, I'm sure you're all aware. So the lobbying work that was going on at that time was on behalf of all those organizations, but it was being dictated by groups with a much broader constituency, with much broader fundraising goals. There wasn't a lot of active participation from the curricular organizations, and that was a major concern. So as part of the directive to become the national voice for music education, what we did was we took a look at the landscape, we figured out where the music education cause in and of itself was lacking in establishing a footprint in Washington, D.C. and we developed a series of initiatives to combat that. So the national voice is your federal lobbying presence on Capitol Hill now. We have 2 registered lobbyists, myself being one of them. I know that that's a very dirty word outside of the Beltway, so please don't throw tomatoes at me. I am a lobbyist, but I can sleep well at night. It's a good cause. It's a really good cause to work for. I'm not the kind of lobbyist that you read about, hopefully, most of the time. But we do lobby for sequential standards-based music education, specifically. That's a very specific cause, and as I mentioned before, it's very different from the kind of advocacy work that was being conducted on your behalf by others, which was very problematic. The second prong of our work, which is also very important, is the coalition work that we do at the national level. And there's sort of a segue here that I want to make sure that I don't miss. So when we did that environmental scan and we said, how can we become a voice for music education advocacy on the national level, we decided we would call in everybody who had been involved in this work in the past decade or so, arts education work, and talk to them about the issues that they were working on, good and bad. Try to establish common ground and figure out whether there was a way to come up with a common legislative agenda for those that were working on behalf of music education. Not arts education broadly, but sequential standards-based music education, excuse me. We had a meeting that we called a Music Education Policy Roundtable. We had a number of groups that came that were represented, some of them listed in your folders that I'm sure you'll be very familiar with, others maybe not, all national organizations that were conducting that work. And out of that meeting in Reston, we did develop a very loosely defined set of national legislative asks. In the time after that, for about 6 months, the communication between the National Association for Music Education and those organizations amped up tremendously. I was constantly responding to emails from their leaders and members about getting more involved, what we could do together, how NAfME could boost their efforts it became very clear to us that there was a very realistic possibility of establishing a sincerely dedicated music education coalition that was focused on your issue. Out of that effort came the current Music Education Policy Roundtable, which was formalized 2.5 years ago with our partners in the American String Teachers Association, who are a substantial financial backer of our efforts. But that coalition has now grown to 22 groups, all of which pay a retainer to the National Association for Music Education for our lobbying services, and lobby under our one unified set of legislative asks, which is again provided for you in your folder. That coalition work has absolutely transformed the way music education is represented on Capitol Hill and viewed throughout the country. The footprint of the National Association for Music Education when it comes to advocacy work is now second to none in this space. I would put it even so high as above Americans for the Arts, which has been the gold standard in arts education advocacy for the past decade. We are extraordinarily excited about the impact that we've been able to make, that your leaders in particular have been able to make once a year when they come to Capitol Hill. We are a brand name now. We are a household name when it comes to music education advocacy, and the Roundtable is a huge part of that. And the groups that partner with us, which are also committed to the same kind of sequential standards-based music education that we all care about so deeply, are on board. We don't have to sell them anything. We don't have to convince them when the key moments come along. They trust us to lobby on their behalf, and their members do the same kind of advocacy work that we're asking of you guys and your members, and that gives us that many more foot soldiers in the fight. Beyond that coalition work, we also do have friends in the other arts. We work in something called the Arts Education Policy Working Group, which is kind of the old standard for advocacy work at the national level. It's representatives of a variety of different curricular organizations and some of the others like Americans for the Arts and the League of American Orchestras that do work on behalf of the cause, less focused work, broader work for the good of the cause. But it's an important coalition to be a part of as well. You've got to have friends throughout the arts. We also work in a group called the College Career and Citizenship Readiness Coalition, which is representative of all of us non-STEM beleaguered subjects that seem to get a bad rap on Capitol Hill. So your foreign languages, your histories, your PE, even health education, all represented in this coalition, which is a very strong coalition on Capitol Hill, again with a unified set of asks. And at the 40,000 foot level, we're members of the Committee for Education Funding, which is the largest education funding coalition in the United States of America. It's over 110 groups now. We are the only arts education group in that coalition. So we're holding down the fort, but they are a tremendous resource for NAfME and for your state because they provide us with access to the White House, to key meetings with OMB and the Domestic Policy Council, to access to members of Congress themselves rather than just staff as need be, and with information, breaking news items, draft pieces of legislation, briefings, hearings, etc. On demand in a way that we would never be able to do on our own, quite frankly. So our coalition work is fundamental to the growth of the footprint for music education. It is a big, big reason why we have been able to establish the benchmarks that we have so far in the past 3 years. And it's something that, again, when we move into Tennessee advocacy, I'll stress to you is equally important as at your level. Last but not least is the capacity building work that we're doing with the states. So, as I mentioned before, once a year we do have an annual Capitol Hill Day. On that day, I get to meet with your leaders and leaders from all across the country and the National Executive Board of NAfME and take them to Capitol Hill. This year was particularly exciting because there has been so much movement on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And we had the really amazing experience of having your leaders get a tangible feel for what it's like to really impact, to influence legislation, rather than to just talk about broad asks if and when a bill goes to the floor. This year we were really in the thick of it, and I was actually just reading through some of the survey responses this morning. We just got our survey back from our National Assembly meeting. And more than anything, when it came to Hill Day, that's what your leaders were talking about this year. They were talking about how they could really feel like they were sincerely influencing the process, and that their level of education with the issues had gotten better, and that their relationships with members of Congress were improving over the years of doing this. So that Hill Day is extremely important, and it's a very, very successful event. We had over 150 people on Capitol Hill this year. We had collegiates on Capitol Hill this year. We had members of the Music Education Policy Roundtable. We had them on Capitol Hill, and we had a special guest, actually, that Diane mentioned earlier this morning, Sarah Darling, the rising country star, joined us on Capitol Hill and was a great advocate. And I have to tell you, I know that this is not really popular with some music educators, but the value of celebrities, celebrity engagement, PR buzz, is extraordinarily important to our cause. Even if you don't really love the idea of a celebrity representing you, swallow hard, because we need them. They don't need us, but we need them. And they're valuable to growing our brand and making us a bigger issue on Capitol Hill and really across the country. And you guys, I mean, we're in Nashville here. You know the importance of access to people that will sell your message, take your message to the streets, so to speak. Take advantage of those opportunities. If you've got one, if you've got a connection to someone, talk to your leadership. We have to grow those relationships. They're very important. But the capacity building extends beyond Hill Day. We provide a variety of opportunities for engagement with state leaders and boots on the ground members. We have an advocacy webinar series. We have a site called the Music Education Groundswell that's devoted to sharing strategies, success stories, Capitol Hill news, and also state and local news that comes directly from state leaders and from members in school districts across the country. Provides a variety of resources, and we get about 2,000 hits a month on that website from people coming to learn about music education advocacy and to engage at the groundswell level, the grassroots level, which is the most important form of advocacy work. Beyond that, we also develop strategic plans with the states. This is something we're going to talk about taking first steps toward today here in Tennessee. You're lucky enough to have an advocacy chair here. You have a starting point. But beyond that, we'd like to grow our presence. We'd like to have a task force in Tennessee devoted to advocacy. So you have a team of first responders, if and when need be. And even more importantly than that, you have people who are disseminating the message all the time, getting the word out of the importance of protecting programs, talking to parents, talking to boosters, talking to community leaders, talking to school boards about protecting programs all the time, not just when programs are in crisis. So we do a lot of work with the states to build that capacity and also to put ourselves in a position to better help the states when there is a problem. Because I have 3 people on my staff, and we are a 21st century advocacy organization, but we can't possibly know what's going on here or in California or in Utah without the information flowing up. That's the direction it has to come. So it's my job to build those relationships with your leaders and with you, and to make sure that you're comfortable sharing information with us and vice versa. Those are the key elements that the National Association works on when it comes to lobbying and advocacy on your behalf. Just want to see what time it is.
No, you're fine.
Am I okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. The next thing I definitely want to hit is what's been happening with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I'll try not to go too deeply into the weeds here and go into my Beltway talk mode, but I do want to stress the importance of the progress we've seen on Capitol Hill in the past couple months. The difference between the energy right now, in spite of all the partisanship in Washington, D.C., and the inability to get anything done, seemingly, and even 3-4 years ago when it comes to education reform, was tremendous. I'm sure you're all aware the Secretary of Education came out with this new waiver system that's replacing AYP. Of course, that's taken place in Tennessee and in almost every state throughout the country. And in many ways, the Department of Education is really making education policy these days, to the point where there are even lawsuits challenging the department's authority to do that in the place of Congress. It's been quite a scene up there, I have to tell you. But in recent months, Chairman Tom Harkin of the Senate Help Committee and Ranking Member Lamar Alexander, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with, have managed to find some degree of common ground on education reform. And with Chairman Harkin reaching the end of his final term and being deeply, deeply devoted to the cause of education, he has made one last final push towards trying to reauthorize this bill before he goes out. At the same time that these conversations have been happening in the Senate, a very different set of conversations has been happening in the Republican-led House. where the chairman, John Klein, has been working on the Republican side to pass a much smaller footprint for education policy, one that really cuts all the federal involvement, which I know is actually quite popular in many parts of the South, with all the blowback to Common Core that I'm sure you're aware of, and the Tea Party energy against federal intrusion in education and other issues. There's a lot of support for the model in the Republican-led House. Unfortunately, to be quite blunt with you, it does not do anything for music and the arts. So I guess what I would stress before I go into any more detail about ESEA reform is that when I go to the states and I talk about this, I have to make very clear, we are a 501c3. We do not have political investment in either party. We cannot legally. Most of our state organizations cannot either. It's a very dangerous water to tread into, and we desperately try to make sure that people understand that. However, the reality of the matter is that our issue is one that should never be partisan, and we do have support in both chambers, in both parties. We don't have a good understanding in the House of how to work with our colleagues on building a presence for music and the arts in the new version of ESEA. And that is a major problem for us. So I can't stress enough that if your personal political persuasion is that the federal government should get itself out of making education policy, or really any policy, you're entirely entitled to that opinion, and I'm not here to change your mind. But what I would say to you is, since the federal government is in the business of making education policy, we better be darn sure that they're representing music education, which needs all the help that it can get. And on the Senate side right now, we're getting that support. We're getting that support from Chairman Harkin's office. I'll talk to you about what that looks like. And we're getting it from Lamar Alexander's office. We're not getting it on the House side. And we have to find a way to make inroads, not just with the Republicans, with the Democrats there that have basically stonewalled any progress for ESEA in the House at all. And as we move towards a conference process, hopefully in the next few months, there's going to need to be some common ground. So what do we hope that common ground looks like? In your folders, there's some information about what we've been able to accomplish in the Senate. For the first time ever, we have a reauthorization bill that specifically enumerates music education separately from the arts. So whenever there's been legislation passed in previous years, you've had the all-encompassing arts listed as whatever that means under different circumstances. And that is a huge problem for advocates. What I hear more than anything from people back at home is that they need something that they can take to their principal, to a school board, to a parent, to any kind of supporter, and show them in federal statute is as close to a mandate for teaching music education during the curricular school day as possible. Having the enumerated line item for music education for the first time in that Senate bill shows that the Senate is starting to take us a lot more seriously, that they're hearing our message, that they're understanding what our leaders are coming and talking to them about, and that they recognize the classroom penetration level for music education specifically, even though we love all of the arts, and that by furthering the music education cause in federal statute, we're protecting music for the next generation of kids and the next generation of kids, and we're starting to crack the door open to other legislative possibilities that will impact us not only at the federal level, but really throughout the country. And that's a theme that I want to stress today. What happens in Washington does not stay in Washington. It's not like Vegas. It does affect you. It does affect your classrooms and your kids. So please take that away from this message. It is really important that you're involved with what's happening in D.C., that you're following the news, and that you're participating in conversations with your legislators. So know that Chairman Harkin's bill has a lot of good for music and the arts in it, and that we are working closely with Senator Lamar Alexander's office to try to find some common ground moving forward as the bill goes to the Senate floor, probably in late October, November. And we're going to be counting on you guys in Tennessee to support those efforts, particularly with Senator Lamar Alexander's office, to buttress support for this model, which is the only one of the 4 ESEA bills that's been proposed that has a legitimate chance of passing. That's the update on ESEA. It's been a crazy whirlwind couple of months, but it is our best chance of reauthorizing the bill probably for the last 10 years. And if it doesn't happen this time, it's very likely to happen next time. So the importance of building on these experiences and creating a groundswell of energy so that people know who we are, they recognize what our legislative asks are, and they want to be involved with you. They want to know that you're expert resources. I can't stress the value of that. Very quickly, I want to touch on one more issue before we move into the state level material, which is by far the most important part of our conversation today. But I did have a request to talk to you guys a little bit about the STEM to STEAM movement. Quick show of hands, is everybody aware of STEAM? Is this, yeah, okay. So the STEAM movement has become very, very popular in Washington, D.C. It's a very powerful message that now has a congressional caucus in the House. Actually, your leaders were part of a ceremony where we recognize the bipartisan caucus that's led by Suzanne Bonamici and Aaron Schock in the House. And they are working very hard with the entirety of the arts education field to try to grow the STEAM brand. They think that there's a lot of potential, a lot of value for them as leaders in trying to sell to their colleagues and sell to businesses, quite frankly, the idea of adding the A in STEM, which of course we've been hearing about ever since President Obama got elected. We have had a lot of concerns about the STEAM movement because what we have seen out of the gate was that it was primarily being funneled through by business leaders, and that music education specifically was being excluded from the conversation in favor of art and design. So for months behind the scenes we were working with our congressional leaders to change that conversation, to change the messaging so that it was more inclusive of an all arts message and sequential standards-based learning rather than integration. Music as a core academic subject, which is of course what our message is all about. I'm very pleased to say that the reason we recognize the STEAM leaders at our National Assembly is because we got them to make that change. They are now working very closely with us on how they talk about STEAM. Actually, during the House debate on ESEA, Suzanne Bonamici talked about music education with relation to STEAM for the first time ever. We're developing a variety of new tools to help your state level leaders integrate STEAM, learn how to get STEAM grants, understand what STEAM can do and what it can't do, and talk about it using the right language to benefit music education specifically. So while we don't have much more time to get into it today, there's a fact sheet in your folders about STEAM. I want you to know that the National Association for Music Education is deeply invested in funneling the direction of that conversation to one that is most productive for your classrooms and your students. And I'm more than happy to continue having dialogues with all of you about what you need from us in order to better understand the issues and facilitate conversations at your level here in Tennessee.